good morning. The portion for today's meditation is taken from Mathew chapter 8 verses 1 to 4. The first verse of Mathew 8. When Jesus had come down from the mountain, great crowds followed him, refers to the close of the foregoing Sermon on the Mount, and it also links to the miracles that follow with Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Matthew desires the readers to see connections between the Sermon on the Mount in chapter 5 to 7 and the miracles that follow in Matthew 8. Matthew's Gospel declares Jesus to be the King by reason of prophecy, paternity, preaching, and power. Jesus does everything by design. All that Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, he will now prove as he leaves the mountain. Jesus does not simply have principles for the kingdom, he has the power and authority to fulfill those principles. And as we read on, it would appear that at least one person had heard and understood the Sermon on the Mount and its implications. A leper, a man full of leprosy, says Luke chapter 5 verse 12, which in those days was a familiar and affecting symbol of sin, considered as loathsome, spreading, and incurable. We read about that in Leviticus chapter 13 verses 45 and 46. Leprosy was a kind of terrible progressive death in which a man dies by inches. The physical condition of the leper was terrible, but the way they were treated made it worse. As we move on to the next verses, we read about the leper's approach, which shows confidence, humility, and reverence. Mark 1:40 says, he came begging him and kneeling. Luke 5:12 says, he bowed with his face to the ground and begged him, saying, Lord, if you choose, you can make me clean. The man had it right. He was confident. He had no doubt that Jesus was able to heal him. He was right that the only question was whether or not he is willing to do so. He had perfect confidence in Jesus' willingness to welcome this man that anyone else would have driven away. The leper came with humility, saying, if it be your will. It's an expression of total surrender to God concerning his life and trusting that no matter what the outcome, I am in his hands. The leper came with reverence. He had a worshipping faith. He had a huge declaration. He knew and understood that in the presence of Jesus, he was in the presence of God. He got it right by kneeling before him and calling him Lord. And the response of Jesus we immediately note is that of compassion, of willingness. It's a collision of worship and willingness, of surrender and sovereignty. Jesus stretched forth his hands and touched him, and saying, I do choose, be made clean. This touch was purposeful for a man who may not have felt the touch of the human hand for many years. No other disease or hatred would have separated a man from his fellow men as leprosy did. And this was the man whom Jesus touched. By his word alone he might have healed the leper, but he applied at the same time the touch of his hand to express the feeling of compassion. It's an expression and token of infinite grace and goodness. Then he ordered the man to keep silence and not to say to anyone. He had to work almost in secrecy until men knew him for what he was, until they learned the right things to say about him. After that, he asked the man to show himself to the priest. At that time, a leper, in order to be reintegrated into the community, needed a certificate of healing confirmed by the priest. Jesus obliges the person and the authority to recognize that the man had been cured and he was able to live normally. Thus, Jesus not only heals but wants the healed person to be able to live with others. He integrates a person in the fraternal life of the community. As we bow before him as our Lord and Master and articulate to him what only he can do in our lives, Jesus says, I am willing, and another mountain is moved.